Community property. What types of property are separate property? There are 5 types. Property owned before the marriage, acquired during the marriage by gift, partitioned community property, property acquired with separate funds, and tort recovery for personal injury when it's not medical or loss of earning potential. What types of property are community property? Property other than separate property acquired during marriage and income from separate property unless the spouses agree in writing that the income will be separate. Income from gift property of one spouse to other, or partitioned community property. When is the status of property determined? The character of an asset is determined at the time the asset is acquired. This rule, called the inception of title rule, applies to all assets but employee retirement benefits. What is the community presumption? All assets acquired during marriage are presumed to be community property. All assets acquired on credit during marriage are presumed to be acquired on community credit. All assets on hand when the issue is raised is presumed to be community. The burden on proving property is separate is on the proponent by clear and convincing evidence. What happens if community funds are spent on separate property or separate funds are spent on community property? A claim for economic contribution arises at the termination of the marriage. A multiplier is figured by dividing the amount of contribution by the equity on the date of first contribution plus all contributions and is multiplied by the equity on the date of termination of marriage. So community divided by equity plus contributions multiplied by equity equals the claim. What is the status of property that was adversely possessed, begun before marriage, and finished during marriage? If the spouse was a naked trespasser, the property is community. If the spouse entered under a rightful claim, the property is separate. What is the effect of title being taken only in one spouse's name? In common law states, the person that takes title is the owner. In community property states, the title does not determine characterization. Rather, under the inception of rule, it's the time and circumstances of the acquisition. One exception is when one spouse using separate property takes title to an asset in other spouse's name. The presumption in that situation is that a gift was intended. How are employee retirement benefit plans handled? The benefits accumulated during marriage are community property. Defined benefit plans are number of years while married divided by number of years total. You freeze the retirement benefit as of the date of the divorce. Defined contribution plans just subtract the value on day of marriage from current value. A deceased spouse has no interest in retirement benefits. How are business increases during marriage handled? For business owned during marriage, the increases allow a reimbursement claim if the spouse spent more time than he was fairly compensated for and more than necessary to preserve the separate estate. How is property divided upon divorce? A court will effect a just and right division of community property. The court may consider the age and physical condition of the parties, ability and earning power of the parties, needs for future support, size of the estate, benefit spouse would have received from continuation of marriage, and fault. This is reviewed on manifestly unjust standard. How is property discovered after a divorce is handled? Later discovered community property is subject to a just and right distribution in a separate action. Statute of limitations is 2 years from the point the other party repudiated the claim of community ownership. How are co-mingled bank accounts handled? Community funds are presumed to be withdrawn first. Thus, the lowest intermediate balance will be considered separate property. When can spousal maintenance be ordered? If a couple is married at least 10 years and one spouse lacks sufficient property to provide for her minimum needs, the spouse seeking support must be unable to support herself because of a disability, be a custodian of a disabled child, or lack employment skills adequate to provide for her minimum reasonable needs. How much money can be awarded as spousal maintenance? A maximum of $2,500 a month or 20% of spouse's average monthly income, no more than 36 months unless spouse is disabled. How is property of a bigamist marriage handled? If spouse is unaware of the bigamist marriage, she is called a putative spouse, and the relationship is characterized as a partnership. If spouse is aware of pre-existing marriage, the relationship is characterized as a meretricious relationship, and the spouse gets nothing. What are the requirements for a premarital agreement that would alter the character of community assets? It must be in writing and signed by both parties. No consideration is required. Parties may agree that separate property remains separate property. Agreement can govern the disposition of property upon separation, divorce, or death. Agreement cannot agree that premarital property becomes community property after marriage. Cannot limit obligation to provide child support. How can a premarital agreement be set aside? By proving that it was not signed voluntarily or unconscionable when made, and there was no fair disclosure of spouse's property or obligations. How can premarital separate property be converted to community property? Spouses can agree in writing to convert separate property to community property. Spouses can also agree to convert community property to separate property and can even partition unequally. Okay. Are survivorship agreements valid for disposition of community property? Yes. The agreement must be in writing and signed by both spouses. Either spouse can revoke with written notice to other, and a court order will be necessary to adjudicate the agreement valid. Parentheses, clear title. What power does one spouse have to challenge the community property gift of another spouse? One spouse can make reasonable gifts of community property as long as such gifts are not so disproportionate as to be in fraud of the spouse's community rights. What effect does a divorce have on pre-existing creditors? A divorce does not affect the rights of pre-existing creditors. If only one party is personally liable because the other didn't sign, creditor can go after community property in an in rem suit seeking to have a constructive trust placed on the property. What is a liability for torts committed by one spouse? All community property is subject to judgment for torts committed during marriage. One sole joint management community property is available to satisfy a pre-marriage tort. What is the liability of one spouse for contracts entered into by the other? Each spouse has a duty to support the other spouse and his or her minor children. Each spouse is personally liable for the other spouse's contracts for necessaries. Other contracts where other spouse is not personally liable, creditors can only reach liable spouse's property subject to his control. Okay, that's it for the community property